In December of 1991, high in the Himalayas, a decision was made that could not be undone. The mountains did not announce danger immediately. They rarely do. What they offer instead is scale, silence, and time. Enough time for confidence to settle in, for routine to replace caution, and for small choices to feel harmless. James Scott arrived in Nepal, believing he was at the beginning of something meaningful. He was 22 years old, an Australian medical student with strong grades, disciplined habits, and a future that appeared carefully mapped. His elective placement at a Kathmandu hospital was confirmed. His relationship back home was stable. This journey was not an escape, it was a pause between milestones. He was not reckless by nature. He trained consistently, hiked regularly, and practiced karate at a competitive level, eventually earning a black belt and winning national championships. His body was conditioned, his mind was structured. He was a man who understood the mechanics of the human body and the necessity of discipline. Risk, when taken, was usually calculated. Nepal offered movement and altitude, forests and passes, paths carved by centuries of foot traffic. Trekking was common. Lodges existed, maps existed, other hikers passed through daily. Nothing about the plan suggested disappearance. That sense of normalcy would be the most dangerous thing he carried into the mountains. James did not arrive alone. He traveled to Nepal with a close friend, Tim Hooper, intending to settle in before his hospital work began. The weeks before December were filled with preparation that felt sufficient. They visited the hospital, met staff, and learned the city's rhythms. When doctors and nurses heard about James's love for hiking, they encouraged him to use his free time to explore the nearby Himalayas. It seemed like the perfect way to spend his final weeks of freedom. The first trek went smoothly. The Jamsum Trail unfolded without resistance. Forests opened into valleys. Altitude increased gradually. The weather stayed manageable. They hired porters and a guide, carried ample supplies, and completed the route without incident. They saw other trekkers, in simple jackets and sneakers, moving with an ease that made James and Tim feel they had perhaps over-prepared. The mountains felt challenging but not hostile. That success mattered more than it should have. It created a quiet distortion. Experience replaced caution. Difficulty was reinterpreted as familiarity. When they returned to Kathmandu, they were already planning another trek. Confident, they now understood what the Himalayas demanded. The timing, however, had changed. December in the Himalayas is not September. Winter compresses margins. Snow erases paths. Cold punishes hesitation. Preparation that once felt excessive was now essential. They did not adjust enough. For the second trek, toward the Helambu Trail, they packed lightly. Too lightly. Gear was reduced to fit rucksacks. Extra layers were left behind. Fire-starting tools were shared. Maps were limited. What they gained in comfort, they lost in redundancy. On December 21st, they set out again. The plan felt safe, predictable, but even early on, subtle fractures appeared. Advice from other trekkers conflicted. Maps disagreed. Confidence filled the gaps where certainty should have lived. By the time they reached the trail junction at Therapati, the decision that would isolate James was already forming. The trail split, and with it, the group did as well. Tim's leg injury had worsened, turning each step into agonizing strain. He made the decision to return to Kathmandu. James offered to go with him, but hesitation lingered. Another hiker, Mark Fulton, had joined them earlier, and together they discussed alternatives. In a moment that felt insignificant, James handed Tim the newer, more detailed map provided by German trekkers, keeping an outdated, vague one for himself. A single lighter remained with Tim as well. No one stopped to reconsider what had just been lost: the ability to navigate precisely and the ability to create heat. James continued on with Mark toward the Gosainkan Trail, reassured by passing trekkers who said the route was difficult but clear. That night, snow fell lightly. By morning, clouds thickened. The trail was still visible, just enough to encourage movement. Conditions shifted with terrifying speed. Snow intensified. Visibility collapsed into a blinding white wall. Footprints disappeared almost as soon as they were made. When James and Mark were briefly separated by a creek shouting replaced sight. 15 minutes of panic passed before they found each other again. James wanted to turn back. Mark believed forward was better, confident he could find a way down. The disagreement ended quietly. They chose different directions. There was no argument, no raised voices, just two figures moving apart into the falling snow. James turned back alone. He followed what he thought were his own tracks until they vanished under a fresh, heavy shroud of white. Landmarks dissolved into the gray mist. The storm erased scale and distance. Soon he could see no more than 30 feet in any direction. The realization came without drama, a cold sinking in the chest. He was lost. Instinct pushed him toward a nearby creek, assuming water would lead somewhere lower, somewhere human. He checked his outdated map. The creek appeared to run toward a town called Talu. It was a thin hope, but it was the only one left. The terrain tightened as he followed the water. Valleys narrowed into canyons. Rock walls rose higher, closing in until the sky became a thin, distant strip. Several streams merged into a small river, reinforcing the illusion of a way out. Instead, the path ended abruptly. The river dropped away into a massive, thundering waterfall. James approached the edge of the waterfall with a medical student's precision, measuring the drop with his eyes. It was a sheer fall, close to 30 meters of slick, dark rock and plunging water. There was no route down. Turning back meant a vertical ascent against a thickening wall of snow and ice, with zero visibility. To stay was to freeze. To go back was a gamble against gravity. The only remaining option was up, not back the way he came, but up the jagged cliff face that flanked the falls. He was not a climber. He possessed a deep-seated fear of heights, a vertigo that usually kept his feet firmly on the trail. But the mountain had stripped away the luxury of phobias. The rock face above him offered only intermittent ledges, slick with a treacherous glaze of ice. He began to climb, moving with a slow, agonizing deliberation. He used his fingers to probe for cracks and his karat-honed balance to shift his center of gravity. Progress was measured, not in meters but in inches. Several times the world tilted as his boots lost purchase, his life hanging by the friction of his fingertips against frozen stone. After nearly 2 hours of physical and mental exhaustion, he reached the crest and collapsed into the snow, his lungs burning in the thin, frigid air. The summit offered no path to safety, but it offered a sanctuary. A shallow, rocky overhang sat like a stone lip above the valley, shielding a small patch of earth from the direct assault of the wind and snow. James lay there shaking as the adrenaline of the climb began to ebb, replaced by the creeping lethality of the cold. He remembered the lectures from medical school on the stages of hypothermia. He knew that wet cold kills with a speed that dry cold does not. In a move of profound self-discipline, he stripped off his soaked layers, shivering violently in the open air. He used a small towel to dry every inch of his skin until it glowed red, then dressed again in what little dry clothing remained. He accepted the immediate discomfort of the freezing air to avoid the long-term death sentence of damp fabric. That night, he crawled into his sleeping bag beneath the stone, listening to the wind move through the mountain like a living thing. Morning did not bring the clarity he hoped for. The snow was deeper, the world even more silent. He attempted to move, locating another creek that seemed to offer a downward trajectory, but the geography was a labyrinth. Every step required a Herculean effort to lift his legs through the drifts. After 2 hours of grueling labor, he checked his progress. He had traveled barely a kilometer. By late afternoon, his strength had evaporated. He found another overhang, a mirror of the first, and prepared for a second night. This time, the cold reached deeper into his marrow. His feet had gone numb, a hollow, heavy sensation that signaled the retreat of his circulation. Shivering came in rhythmic waves, then stopped altogether. He recognized the sign his body was losing the ability to generate heat. Believing the end was near, he reached for a pen and a small notebook. With stiff, fumbling fingers, he wrote to his family. He didn't write of the cold or the fear. He wrote of his regret. He apologized for the pain his disappearance would cause them, for the milestones he would miss, and for the recklessness he hadn't intended, but had nonetheless displayed. When the letter was finished, he folded the paper with a surgeon's care and tucked it into a pocket, a final message for whoever would eventually find his body. Then he lay back and waited for the sleep that usually leads to death. But the morning came anyway. As James entered the second week, his world contracted. It was no longer a journey across the Himalayas. It was a journey through the minutes of the day. Hunger, which had been a sharp, screaming presence in his stomach, began to fade into a dull background hum. His body was beginning to consume itself, a biological fire, burning its own furniture to keep the lights on. He replaced food with snow, pressing the cold crystals into his mouth until his tongue felt like a piece of wood. He turned to his internal architecture for strength. He visualized his carrot forms, the katas he had practiced thousands of times. He would spend hours in his mind, perfecting the angle of a strike, the tension of a block, the breath of a movement. This mental discipline kept the shadows of despair at bay. Then the mountain reminded him that he was not the only living thing in the silence. One afternoon, a series of violent, guttural screams shattered the quiet. James sat up, heart hammering against his ribs. A Himalayan black bear emerged from the brush, barely 30 meters away. It was a massive, dark shape against the white, its breath visible in the air. In a moment of pure, instinctive defiance, James grabbed his dissection scissors, the only weapon he had. He didn't feel fear, he felt a strange, aggressive lucidity. He shouted at the bear, his voice thin but sharp, almost daring the predator to end the suspense of his survival. The bear, perhaps sensing the erratic energy of a man with nothing left to lose, paused, huffed, and then turned, vanishing back into the tree line. For nights afterward, James lay awake, his scissors clutched in his hand, listening for the sound of heavy paws on the ice. While James fought for his life, in the silence, the world outside was erupting into a frantic, disjointed search. In Australia, his sister Joanne Robertson had become the anchor for the family's hope. She refused to accept the silence of the mountains. When she arrived in Kathmandu, she found a search effort hamstrung by bureaucracy and the sheer hostility of the winter weather. Rescuers were being turned back by the same storms that had trapped her brother. Desperate, Joanne sought out a source of information that defied her rational upbringing. She was led to a Buddhist Lama, a spiritual leader reputed to see things hidden from the eyes of men. The Lama did not ask for GPS coordinates or flight paths. He sat in a meditative silence, his eyes closed, as if scanning a map only he could see. Finally, he pointed to a specific, unlikely triangle of terrain between the villages of Fidi, Gopt, and Talu. He told Joanne that her brother was there and that they would meet again. The professional mountaineers dismissed the suggestion as superstition. They argued the terrain was impassable. But Joanne held on to the Lama's words like a lifeline. By the 30th day, James was a shadow. His muscle mass had melted away, leaving his skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Mouth ulcers made every swallow an agony, and a throat infection had reduced his voice to a rasp. Then he heard it, the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of a helicopter. He dragged his wasted body into a clearing, waving his sleeping bag with the last of his strength. He even stripped off his outer layers to reveal the bright red fabric of his thermal clothing, a desperate flare against the white. The aircraft circled, hovering for a moment that felt like an eternity. James felt a surge of hope so violent it was painful. But the helicopter turned. It didn't descend. It flew back over the ridge and disappeared. The silence that followed was the heaviest he had ever known. To be seen and then abandoned was a psychic blow that nearly broke him. He spent the next 12 days in a state of suspended animation. He no longer expected to be saved, he only expected to endure. His feet had turned a bruising necrotic blue. He took his dissection scissors and pressed the point into the flesh of his foot. He saw the metal disappear into the skin, saw a bead of dark blood form, but felt absolutely nothing. the nerves had died. He was no longer a medical student observing a patient. He was the patient watching his own body fail in real time. On the 42nd day, the sound returned. This time, the helicopter stayed longer. It hovered, dipping its nose, as if acknowledging the small red-clad figure below. James waved until he collapsed, his face pressed into the snow. He knew he had been seen. He also knew that the helicopter could not land in this terrain. Rescue would have to come on foot, and in his condition, he calculated he had perhaps 48 hours of life remaining. Voices arrived when he was at the very edge of consciousness. He thought they were hallucinations, a final trick of a dying brain. He heard the crunch of boots on the frozen crust. Two rescuers appeared beneath the overhang, their faces hidden behind goggles and masks. One of them knelt beside him and asked, "Are you James Scott?" When he managed a whispered, "Yes." The men didn't just record his vitals, they broke protocol and embraced him weeping, with a mixture of shock and relief. They told him that in the history of these mountains, no one had ever lasted more than 10 days. In these conditions, James had survived 43. The extraction was a blur of motion and light. He was winched into a helicopter and flown toward a world he had forgotten existed. When the aircraft touched down, the doors slid open to the humid, living air of the lowlands. Joanne was there. She saw a man she barely recognized, a skeletal, bearded figure with hollow eyes. But when they embraced, the silence of the last 6 weeks finally broke. James Scott returned to Australia.
The mountain was harsh, unforgiving. Every move was a negotiation with survival itself.
We understand.
But we made it through.
A different man. He finished his medical degree, his hands eventually regaining the precision required for surgery, though his feet would always carry the numb reminders of the frost. He did not seek the spotlight. He returned to the life he had mapped out, but he lived it with a different cadence. The mountains of the Himalayas did not change because a young man survived them. They remained indifferent, their peaks still scraping the sky, their storms still erasing the paths of the unwary. The rock overhang, where he lay for weeks, was eventually reclaimed by the snow, leaving no mark of the struggle that occurred there. What remained was not a story of a man conquering nature, for nature cannot be conquered. It was a story of duration. It was proof that when everything is stripped away, food, warmth, map, and hope, there is still a core of human will that can last for 43 days in the dark. The Himalayas kept their scale. James carried the rest.